Good morning, Dan and Amy. It's interesting, the unfortunate, untimely passing of Dolores O'Riordan from the Cranberries. You're hearing her lovely, kind of haunting voice. Dolores O'Riordan, this probably won't get picked up by too many in the D.C. press corps, much less the music industry. Dolores O'Riordan on the issue of abortion. No, she was Irish. It's not good for women to go through the procedure and have something living sucked out of your bodies. It belittles women. Even though some women say, oh, I don't mind to have one. Every time a woman has an abortion, it just crushes her self-esteem smaller and smaller and smaller.
Wow.
Dolores O'Riordan.
Dead at the age of 46, recently diagnosed or came out and admitted she was bipolar, always had chronic back pain, and she died in a recording studio in London.
Very sad. Very sad.
She has 3 kids that she leaves behind, and she's too young.
Exactly. Must make you think about your own mortality. Not me.
Of course it does.
So one other thing, too, I got to correct. I'm having a poor day, and I apologize. First of all, I misidentified Cobra Kai as Cobra Khan from Karate Kid earlier in the show. And now, and this is on you, too, because you were in a serious, committed relationship with him, Edward James Olmos.
I was not. I went out to dinner with him.
I said the Jaime Escalante movie was Lean on Me, which, of course, was the Morgan Freeman, Principal Joe Clark movie.
Oh.
Stand and Deliver was the Jaime Escalante story. So I apologize, and, the fact that you didn't catch it, that doesn't speak well of your time with Edward James Olmos. You really should know his full oeuvre if you're going to be in a relationship with him.
It was just dinner, Dan.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. Moving on to serious topics. Interesting op-ed in the Wall Street Journal yesterday from Bill McGurn. He interviewed a friend of the show, James Kallstrom, former deputy director of the FBI. We've had him on the show many times. Oh, yeah. And the title of the piece, Wanted, an Honest FBI. Kallstrom basically says the FBI is in danger of losing the trust of the American people on which it relies. He points to a couple of decisions that were seminal over the last year, among many that he disagrees with, doesn't recognize in terms of the FBI in which he worked. Obviously the Comey exoneration of Hillary was one problem. He also points out, though, a more recent one with the new director, Christopher Wray. During his own recent testimony before Congress, Mr. Wray stonewalled and suggested ridiculously that he couldn't let Congress see classified material. That's McGurn writing. And this is Kallstrom responding, saying they, the FBI, act like they work for someone from outer space rather than the President of the United States. For more on this topic and a couple of others, we're pleased to be joined again by our friend Sharyl Attkisson, who is, again, celebrated investigative reporter, author of The Smear, How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote. Sharyl, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So what about the standing of the FBI and, to some extent, Department of Justice, not from a partisan perspective, but just on the merits of these officials that are acting in ways that officials in their position have heretofore never acted, as well as the exposure of so many obvious conflicts of interest among people in leadership positions in both of those agencies?
Well, we do have unique circumstances, to be sure, but I'm not sure officials have never before acted this way. I kind of assumed that, we knew about J. Edgar Hoover. Do you really think that ever stopped, that at some point all files that he was keeping and all the dirt he had on people was somehow purged or burned or turned over or stopped? Or do you think to some degree that maybe has always been the case and has always continued? I suspect the latter.
Yeah,
and I also think that, there are some important officials who, if you ask the Inspector General for the Department of Justice, are under investigation for what appears to be possibly inappropriate and unethical behavior. And I wrote about this a few weeks ago because that investigation has gotten really very little attention and yet has netted more beef, if you will, than the investigation into Trump administration Russia collusion.
But then when you see one of the FBI agents who's in charge of, the line of questioning geared toward Hillary Clinton, and he clearly has a bias against President Trump, don't you think that affects his judgment and, disintegrates the trust of the American people with the FBI?
Short answer, yes. I think that blatant sort of commentary, I mean, certainly everybody has their opinion, and you can't expect that investigators won't like or dislike certain political figures. But for people who are actually on a political investigation that is supposed to be neutral and that was actually forged so that it could be neutral, for them to have such strong opinions and express them so freely and openly without fear of, being discovered or anybody thinking that was a bad thing, I think indicates there are perhaps some deep-seated problems inside those investigative bodies.
Yeah, it seems to me that maybe is the difference. Maybe some of the behavior is similar, but it was done more surreptitiously previously, J. Edgar Hoover, because there was a recognition that it was wrong. So much of what is being done and said is for public consumption because it seems like there's a certain belief that they're insulated from any accountability. They don't answer to anybody except themselves.
I think that's true. I think that there is a powerful bureaucracy that persists from administration to administration inside our intelligence agencies. And I'm concerned that they've developed a power structure that is more persistent and pervasive than any single political party or administration. Excuse me. And while you might consider that a positive thing in some respects if it weren't so hugely political, because you really don't want them to change from administration to administration based on political whims, in this case, perhaps it's something to be very concerned about that there may be bad actors among our fine intelligence officers who consider themselves, beyond the normal laws, who may be willing to do the bidding of political operatives or use intelligence tools at their disposal for political purposes, which I think there's pretty clear evidence that may have happened as well.
You tweeted last week, as the House took up FISA reauthorization, and Rand Paul expressed some concerns and the possibility that he would filibuster the authorization in current form if there were not more protections in Section 702. Your tweet went viral because it was such a succinct summary of what the government has said versus what they've done. I'll let you kind of recast your own words in terms of your concerns about those intelligence agencies of which you were speaking.
Well, I don't have that in front of me, but I said something like, I don't know if people know the history, that we were never supposed to be surveilled by our own intelligence agencies here in America. That was always considered, totally unconstitutional and something that should never happen. After 9/11, we made provisions to allow that. Actually, some of that had become before 9/11. So at first they weren't supposed to surveil us, but they did. Then they promised they wouldn't contain the information, keep it if it was collected on Americans, and then they made a provision where they do. Then they promised that it would never be searched through. The database of Americans could not be accessed and looked through by, for other reasons, but it is. And then they promised it would never be unmasked, that the Americans' names would not be known even within the intelligence agency, but they are. And, of course, none of this is supposed to be leaked, but it has been. So if you just look at the slippage of, what's supposed to be and where we are today, it's pretty shocking. When you talk about this new authorization Congress is about to give for this authority to continue, which I think is very important that they have it, but obviously it needs more oversight. And I'm kind of shocked that members of Congress who themselves have been spied on, we know this for a fact by our intel agencies inappropriately, that they are not going to put more oversight on this or try to fix the problems or make the extension very temporary until these investigations are over is shocking to me. And I wrote an article in The Hill that completely, I think, destroyed the FBI director, Christopher Wray's claim to Congress, which I believe is false, that there has been no 702, that's the name of the provision under the Act. There has been no 702 abuse. I went down the list of all the 702 abuses that have been categorized by the FISA court and in public documents that we know about. So I don't know why he was saying that, but that's been oft repeated since then. Even members of Congress have said, oh, this is a provision where there's no controversy dealing with foreign collection. No, this is the provision that is controversial, 702, where they have used foreign collection rules to collect evidence on Americans and members of Congress and journalists and others that they should never have done.
Is there
So
a concrete example you could give us of something that was on the list?
Yeah. In 2016, just January 2016, the Inspector General for the NSA issued a top secret report criticizing the NSA for not having proper processes in place to protect Americans. He gave instances of non-compliance, that documentation was lacking. This went to the FISA secret court, which said the problem was widespread under all periods under review. A couple other quick ones. The FISA court in 2015 criticized the NSA practice of collecting intelligence the way they were using it, said that it likely netted information on U.S. citizens with no foreign intelligence value. And also at another hearing, the FISA judge accused the NSA of an institutional lack of candor surrounding that 702 provision and stated this is a very serious Fourth Amendment issue and that he really just hammered the federal government in this hearing. So to say there's been no suspected abuses of 702 is just, I think, maybe a propaganda campaign, because if they just keep saying it, we'll all just go, okay, we'll renew it.
Well, and this a couple of years after Director of National Intelligence James Clapper lied to us. I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, that you just continue to get the same, as you said, propaganda at best, and Congress continues to gobble it up.
Yes, James Clapper falsely testified to Congress when asked by Senator Ron Wyden, who knew the answer from classified information. Is there data being collected on tens of millions of Americans? And Clapper said no. And, you look at the hearing when this was asked, and Wyden kind of shook his head and re-asked the question, and Clapper just said, not wittingly, well, that was completely false. And, I've done stories about data being collected through the telecom agencies, asking for and sometimes forcing their cooperation, but also paying these telecom agencies hundreds of millions of dollars in federal tax money for contracts to do this. This has been going on since pre-9/11, and in ways that people really have no clue.
I wanted to get your take as well on the Dossier story, the Trump Dossier story. Kim Strassel, writing the Wall Street Journal, suggests no such thing as a coincidence in Washington. So the sudden, furious effort by Democrats and the media to provide cover to the Steele dossier, the release of Glenn Simpson's testimony last week by Senator Feinstein. This coincides with congressional investigators finally being given access to FBI records about the Trump-Russia probe. She intimates maybe there's a real concern that their narrative about Russian collusion is about to run into the reality of the documentation that Congress is finally getting. Do you have any particular perspective on that and the timing of it?
Well, just based on experience, I think what you said and what she wrote is accurate. None of this is, by chance. And Senator Feinstein would not normally be someone who would leak something like that. So I think she was convinced to do so because there is a sense of concern among those who have pushed that narrative that it certainly hasn't delivered to date. And quite frankly, I think if Congress weren't doing its own investigation and perhaps the Inspector General, we might not know about any of this. I don't know what the main investigation with the special counsel is covering, but I suspect it might not be covering these things. And, I do think that narrative has fallen apart over the past year based on what we know publicly. It just hasn't delivered, and that's why I feel like we're seeing sort of counter narratives and then moving on to other narratives as well, because this was something that they were kind of hanging their hat on as a distraction at the time, and maybe as something that they hoped could be something that makes us look in the other direction should the Trump administration actually see what some of the intel agencies were doing over the past couple of years politically.
She is Sharyl Attkisson, investigative journalist, author of the new book, The Smear, How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote. Sharyl, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.